this video, and your support by subscribing to this channel is the best way to make that happen. Now, let's get right into the heart of the matter. Tonight, we travel back in time far, far beyond the reach of our streetlights and digital screens, to a world lit only by flickering torchlight and the quiet, measured breath of wind through the ancient wood. The year is 1712, and the deep chill of late October has settled into the very stone and timber of the New England colonies. The thick scent of burning oak and damp earth drifts through the crisp air, and behind the sturdy, wooden shutters of every isolated cottage, shadows dance on the walls like silent, grasping hands. This is an All Hallows Eve in Colonial America. A story of mystery, deep-seated superstition, and the quiet courage needed to face the unknown, all told under a harvest moon that watches everything in silence. Before we begin, take a moment to find comfort wherever you are. Wrap yourself in a heavy blanket. Let your room fall into stillness and allow the sound of my voice to carry you away. If you're joining us from the US, from Europe, from Asia, or anywhere else around the world, welcome. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I love knowing where these stories travel. Whether it's a quiet midnight in London, a dusky evening in New York, or a misty dawn somewhere far across the ocean. Now, take a deep, steady breath, settle in, and let us begin our journey through the haunting stillness of a colonial Halloween night. The last sliver of day had long since been consumed by the endless pines, and the small settlement of Hawthorne Hollow was grimly preparing for All Hallows Eve. Wooden chimneys puffed out trails of thin, gray smoke, coiling like ghostly fingers toward the silver, indifferent sky. The air, heavy and sharp, smelled of sweet corn husks and burning applewood. Children's laughter echoed faintly between the close-set houses, though even their joy carried a nervous hint of the season. After all, this was the night when the veil between the tangible world and the unseen was said to grow thin, almost transparent. Martha Ellery, a young woman of 19, stood by the stone hearth in her family's small cottage, her hands trembling slightly as she finished hanging bunches of dried sage and rosemary above the door lintel. Her mother had always insisted it was a necessary ritual, for the strong, pungent scent of those herbs was said to repel wandering spirits and other darker things that walked on this night. Beyond the small window pane, she could just make out the path leading to the old, unpainted meeting house, dark, silent, and framed by the sharp, skeletal branches of a giant oak. Somewhere in that deep, oppressive quiet, an owl called, a sound that rose through the still air like a question unasked and unanswered. The fire crackled softly, a small, stubborn heart throwing orange light against the rough, dark wooden beams of the ceiling. Martha's father was late returning from the neighboring farm in the next valley, and every passing minute drew her nearer to the window, her breath misting the cold glass. Each shadow cast by the fire looked like a figure, each whisper of wind against the chimney seemed like a hesitant footstep. All Hallows Eve in Hawthorne Hollow was a night not taken lightly. It was a night of vigilance, not celebration. The night had thickened into a velvet blackness, heavy and absolute, when Martha finally gathered her thick wool shawl and stepped outside. The wind brushed her cheeks like a sudden, cold hand, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and faraway, banked fires. In the distance, she could see the faint, nervous flicker of neighbors' lanterns swaying along the main dirt road, where a few stragglers still made their way home from the evening's obligatory harvest feast. The harvest moon hung low and pale, half hidden behind thin, quickly gliding clouds. Beneath her feet, the ground was soft with fallen leaves, a thick carpet of them. Each step made a gentle, muffled crunch, like whispers beneath her worn shoes. Suddenly, a sound. Behind her, a door creaked open and immediately shut. The sound made her freeze, turn completely around, and strain to listen. Nothing. Only the low, consistent murmur of the wind through the topmost trees and the distant, familiar bark of a dog in the village. She pulled her shawl tighter and began to follow the narrow trail leading away from the village and through the initial edge of the woods, the path her father always took on his return from the neighboring farm. She had walked this route hundreds of times before to fetch water or gather wood, but tonight it felt profoundly unfamiliar, as though the forest had subtly shifted its geography while she wasn't looking. The trees leaned closer, their massive trunks dark against the meager moonlight. Their upper branches tangled together overhead, forming an oppressive, black archway of shadows. As she walked, she could smell the faint sweetness of rotting apples that had fallen to the ground and were mixing with the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. Every now and then, a breeze rustled the high leaves, making them shimmer faintly like coins in the dim, inconsistent light. Martha held her shawl even tighter around her shoulders. She whispered a quiet, habitual prayer, one her mother had taught her for journeys against wandering spirits and all unseen, malevolent things. And yet, somewhere just beyond the audible range of her hearing, she thought she caught the faintest, most unsettling sound, footsteps matching her own rhythm. Martha stopped dead. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. For a long, terrifying moment, she stood completely still, her heart thudding softly beneath her wool shawl, a panicked drumbeat in the stillness. The only sound was the sighing of the wind as it passed through the brittle branches above. But then there it was again, unmistakable, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, not far behind her, almost keeping pace. She turned, lifting her small, tallow-lit lantern higher. Its weak glow revealed only the cold, white mist drifting low between the trunks, thin like frozen breath. The path stretched empty behind her, curling into an impenetrable darkness. Yet she could not shake the feeling of being watched, as if the very forest itself were leaning closer to listen to her fear. "Mr. Ellery," she called softly, hoping perhaps it was her father at last, simply weary and walking without care. Her voice broke the silence like a fragile, snapping thread, and when it faded, the woods grew even quieter, absorbing the sound. She waited. Nothing answered. Martha forced herself to move again, one step, then another. The light from her lantern danced along the ground, glinting off wet stones and fallen acorns. She tried to reason with herself, to tell herself it was just her overactive imagination, perhaps a startled deer, or the echo of her own steps against the dense, still night air. But the sound returned, closer and more defined this time. Crunch, pause, crunch. Her pulse quickened, hammering against her ribs. The old, chilling tales her grandmother used to tell began to flutter through her mind, stories of lost, envious souls wandering the woods on All Hallows Eve, searching for warmth, for light, for someone to follow home. And though she told herself she was too old to believe in such folklore, she found herself whispering, "Please, whoever you are, stay back." The wind stirred again, brushing past her ear like a cold, dry whisper. She thought she heard a name carried on it, her name. But when she spun around again, the path behind her was utterly empty. Martha's breathing grew shallow as she pressed forward. The faint, trembling light from her lantern guided her like a tiny, scared star through the trees. The forest seemed alive now, alive in a way that felt utterly watchful and predatory. Each shadow moved differently, and every gust of wind seemed to carry a muffled voice that was almost, but not quite, human. Soon, she reached the small, rough-hewn wooden bridge that crossed the stream, a natural boundary, a place where her father always paused for a moment of rest on his way home. The stream was narrow, but tonight it gurgled louder than usual, swollen by recent, heavy rain. Its waters shimmered silver under the weak moonlight, curling around stones that were smooth as old, submerged bones. As Martha lifted her lantern to illuminate the bridge, she froze. Across the stream, on the opposite bank, another lantern glowed faintly in the mist. It hung low, swaying just above the ground, as if someone were patiently holding it. Yet no figure could be clearly seen. Its light was strange, not the familiar, warm orange of a tallow candle, but a pale, ghostly white that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her terrified heartbeat. Her mouth went bone dry. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the water's restless murmur. the light across the stream didn't move. It just hovered there, flickering with an unnatural regularity, its reflection trembling in the dark current below. She took a single, cautious step closer, the old wood creaking beneath her shoes. Her breath clouded heavily before her in the cold air. Then, as she blinked, the pale light flickered once, twice, and went out completely. Darkness returned, instantaneous and total, like a heavy door slamming shut. The forest once again was utterly still. The only sound was the constant, restless whisper of the stream. She could feel her pulse pounding hard in her neck, an internal frantic rhythm. For a moment, she considered turning back, fleeing toward the known lights of home, but something deep inside, perhaps the desperate need to find her father, perhaps a terrible, cold courage, kept her walking forward, across the bridge, into the place where the strange lantern had been. The air there smelled faintly of smoke and something much older, like damp stone and grave-cold earth. And beneath her feet, she noticed, barely visible in the dim moonlight, a single, clear wet footprint. It was not her own. Martha knelt slowly, her lantern trembling violently in her hand. The light quivered across the print, revealing its shape in unsettling detail. It was a man's footprint, bare, large, and pressed deep into the soft earth by the stream's edge. The toes were long and uneven, imprinted into the mud as if the figure had been standing there only moments ago, a heavy, cold weight. The water's edge rippled softly, carrying the faint, distorted reflection of the moon. She could hear the small, constant splash of the current licking at the stones, and above it, the distant, mournful hoot of the owl. Every natural sound seemed sharper now, magnified by the cold, rising fear in her chest. She reached out one trembling hand and hovered her fingers just above the print. The soil was still wet, still sinking faintly, as if the weight had only recently lifted. Whoever had left it was close. Too close. Then she noticed something else, a scent. It was faint but distinct, like wood smoke, mixed with something sweet, almost metallic. It wasn't the smell of her father's familiar pipe tobacco, nor the earthy scent of a tired farmer. It was stranger, older, a smell that didn't belong to anything she could readily name. Her eyes darted nervously through the lingering fog, searching for any movement. The forest across the stream loomed thick and dark. The branches tangled together like gnarled, reaching fingers. Every tree looked unnervingly alive. Every shadow held a hint of shape. She took a decisive step back, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called softly, demanding an answer. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from deep within the swirling mist, came a sound. Soft, deliberate, almost like laughter. It wasn't loud enough to echo, but it was close enough that she felt its resonance in her spine. Her lantern flickered wildly. The flame leaned sharply to one side, though there was no breeze. And when she looked down again, the footprint was gone. The mud was smooth, untouched, as if the earth had simply swallowed the evidence. She stumbled backward, clutching her shawl to her chest, and began to run down the path toward the village lights. The forest seemed to actively close behind her, the mist curling around her ankles like cold, ephemeral fingers trying to pull her back into the darkness. Martha's steps quickened until the path beneath her feet grew firmer, the soft earth giving way to the packed dirt of the village road. Ahead, she could see the first undeniable flickers of light, warm windows glowing softly through the mist like tiny stars scattered across the heavy dark. The sight filled her chest with both relief and a profound unease, for the village seemed quieter than it should have been on an All Hallows Eve. Usually, laughter, hearty singing, and the lively sound of a fiddle drifted through the streets from the meeting hall, where the town folk gathered to share cider and tales by the great fire. But tonight, only silence greeted her. The air felt heavy, expectant, as if something vast and unseen had passed through moments before her arrival. She hurried past the old blacksmith's shed, its wide door hanging oddly ajar, the familiar smell of coal long faded. The church bell tower stood tall and black against the night sky, its heavy iron bell motionless. A single, small candle burned faintly inside the apothecary's window, its flame bending and stretching with each breath of the nervous wind. Martha paused at the corner near the tavern, listening with painful intensity. Somewhere, faintly, she thought she heard murmurs, low, unintelligible voices speaking behind closed, wooden shutters. But when she turned toward the sound, it stopped instantly, replaced only by the lonely creak of a swinging sign overhead. The sign read, "The Copper Lantern," though tonight its lantern was completely dark. She wrapped her shawl tighter, glancing toward the meeting hall at the end of the road. There, she could see figures moving faintly through the windows, their silhouettes tall and slow. Perhaps the feast was still going on after all, she thought. Perhaps I had imagined the quiet. But as she drew nearer, the sound of those movements struck her as strange, too measured, too heavy, like boots dragging slowly across bare wood. And the windows, though glowing, seemed clouded, as if the light inside was dimmed by a layer of thick, acrid smoke. She hesitated at the door, her hand poised on the cold handle, her heart fluttering like a bird trapped in a cage. Then, from inside, came a sound that made her blood turn instantly cold. A knock. But not from the door she faced. From the inside, against the heavy oak wood, as if something within was pleading, or demanding, to be let out. Martha froze, her fingers hovering just above the door's cold iron handle. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, echoing through the heavy oak. 3 raps, steady, and hollow, like knuckles on an empty coffin. Knock. 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 Her throat tightened into a painful knot. She glanced around, half hoping someone else had heard it, but the village street lay utterly empty, still blanketed in its uneasy hush. The wind had died entirely now. Even the trees at the edge of town stood silent, their branches motionless against the pale glow of the moon. She whispered a shaky prayer, her lips barely moving, and pressed her ear to the door. Inside, there was no laughter, no music, no familiar, comforting voices, only the faint, repeated creak of floorboards and the rhythmic flutter of something brushing against the walls. Gathering what little courage she could, Martha lifted her lantern and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound rolling through the hall like thunder through a hollow canyon. The smell hit her first, smoke, old candle wax, and something deeply sour, something faintly metallic and unsettling. The room was dimly lit by a few dying candles placed haphazardly along the long table. The remains of the harvest feast still lay scattered, plates of bread gone hard, apple cider spilled and tacky across the wood, chairs pushed back in uneven disarray. But not a soul was there. She stepped inside slowly, her shoes clicking loudly against the wooden planks. The floor felt sticky beneath her soles. The air was thick and stale, as though no one had breathed it for hours. Then, behind her, the sound echoed through the empty hall like a final pronouncement. Martha spun around, her lantern quivering, its light dancing. "Is someone here?" she called, her voice small against the sudden silence. No answer came. Only the faint, dying swing of the door settling against its frame. And then, just above her head, she heard it, the same knock, 3 times. This time, it came from the ceiling. For a long, trembling moment, Martha couldn't move. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the rafters, where the shadows gathered thick as ink. The ceiling beams were old and warped, their surfaces dark with centuries of smoke. Between them, faint dust drifted like mist in the lantern's glow. Then, knock. Knock. The sound came again, clearer now, from directly above the main table. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone crawling along the beams with a slow, uneven rhythm. The wood groaned beneath the unseen weight. Her breath hitched. She held the lantern higher, its weak light spilling over the dark rafters. At first, she saw nothing but the tangled shapes of cobwebs. Then, a sudden movement. A flash of pale color disappearing into the darkness above. Martha stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of a chair. It scraped loudly across the floor, echoing like a shout. The knocking stopped. Silence. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. "Who's up there?" she whispered, her voice shaking violently. No reply. She forced herself to look up again, scanning every inch of the rafters. The shadows didn't move this time, but the air felt different, charged, like the moment before a violent electrical storm. And then she heard another sound, not knocking, but something softer, a slow, sickening drip. It came from the beam directly above her. A small drop of something dark fell from the wood and landed on the table with a faint patter. Another followed, and another. She stepped closer, the lantern trembling in her grip. When she lifted it to see, her stomach turned cold. The drops weren't water. They were thick, dark red, and fresh. Her gaze followed the dreadful trail upward until she saw it. Clinging to the beam, suspended in the half-dark, was the unmistakable shape of a man. His face was pale, his eyes open and empty, his body hanging limp from a rope tied roughly around his neck. The rope creaked faintly as the body swayed, knocking gently, knock, 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 against the wood above with the motion. The lantern nearly slipped from Martha's trembling hand. Its light wavered wildly across the rafters, painting the walls in flickering orange and shadow. For an instant, the hanging figure seemed to move, as though it was still alive. But when she blinked, it hung perfectly still again, the faint sway caused only by her own quickened breath disturbing the air. Her pulse roared in her ears, a thunderous sound. She backed away slowly, 1 foot at a time, the hem of her skirt brushing against overturned chairs and cold plates. The scent in the air had changed. It was sharper now, raw and metallic, clinging to her tongue. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat like a physical knot. "Father," she whispered, though she knew the shape above could not be him. It was taller, broader. She could see the outline of old boots, the rough texture of a wool coat. Whoever it was had been dead for hours, maybe longer. Then she heard something else. Not from above, but from the far side of the hall. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. Her eyes darted toward the corner near the fireplace. The shadows there were deep, darker than anywhere else in the room, seemingly consuming the light. The dragging sound came again, slow, deliberate, scraping closer. Martha's lantern flickered, the flame bending violently as though something unseen had brushed past it. The door behind her remained shut, sealed tight, as though bolted from the outside. She wanted to run, to flee into the cold night, but the movement by the hearth held her frozen. The darkness there seemed to shift, to rise, and to breathe. And then, out of that thick shadow, came a whisper so faint she almost believed it was only in her mind. He was the first. Who's there?" she managed to stammer, her voice a reedy tremor. The whisper came again, closer this time, circling her like a voice carried by smoke. The first to open the door when they knocked. The lantern flickered one last, final time, its light faltering, then going out completely. The entire hall was instantly swallowed in blackness. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no movement. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until it feels intensely alive. Martha stood frozen in that absolute blackness, her fingertips still clutching the lantern's cold handle. The faint smell of oil lingered in the air, mixed with the heavy scent of wax and blood. She couldn't see her own hand when she lifted it before her face. The world had dissolved into a darkness so complete that even her sense of direction began to fade. She focused on listening, really listening, for anything beyond her own ragged breath. But the silence held steady, thick and suffocating. Then, softly, came the sound of breathing that was not her own. It came from somewhere behind her, slow, steady, and damp, as though drawn through a throat thick with cold air and dust. Each breath seemed to echo faintly, bouncing off the walls, circling closer. Martha's knees went weak. She turned carefully, her boots scuffing against the wooden floor. Her trembling fingers found the small flint at her belt. With desperate hands, she struck it once, twice. Sparks flared and died quickly in the dark. On the third strike, the lantern flickered weakly to life again, its flame trembling like a frightened, tiny heart. And in that brief light, she saw him. A man stood only a few steps away, half shrouded by the deeper shadows near the long table. His clothes were old, almost tattered, and his skin was as pale as fresh milk. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lantern light, though they seemed to hold no pupils, just two endless, unsettling circles of dull silver. He didn't speak. He only tilted his head slightly as though studying her with an immense, ancient patience. Martha took a step back, her breath quick and shallow. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread. The man smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in an unnatural curve. His teeth were small and too even, like carved bone. "Not who," he murmured, his voice soft as wind through dry leaves. "When?" And before she could speak again, every candle in the hall flared to life at once, burning bright, white, and utterly silent, instantly illuminating the space. The once empty room was now filled with people. Dozens of them, each one sitting perfectly still at the feast table. Each one pale as snow. Each one wearing the same hollow, silver eyes. Martha's lantern trembled in her hands, its glow barely keeping pace with the harsh, cold white light of the new candles. The once empty hall was utterly transformed. The long table, moments ago covered in dusty plates and spilled cider, now held a full, glittering feast. Roasted meats, sweet breads, apples glistening with caramel, and bowls of steaming vegetables. Yet not a single bite had been touched. Around the table sat figures, men, women, and even children, all frozen mid-motion. Their hands hovered over plates or were raised slightly as if in the middle of a toast. Their silver eyes reflected the lantern's light like tiny, cold moons, yet none blinked, none breathed audibly. The smell of old wood and wax mixed with the rich, intense aroma of the feast, an aroma both tantalizing and profoundly unsettling. Martha stepped closer, her boots making small, hesitant sounds on the floor. She noticed details that made her skin prickle with dread. A girl clutching a carved pumpkin, its hollow face frozen in a smile. A man with a fork raised, poised above a roasted fowl. A woman whose fingers rested on a slice of bread, her nails too long and pale, almost translucent. The man with the hollow eyes who had first appeared stood now at the head of the table, gesturing slowly, deliberately, his faint smile never fading. "Welcome," he said softly, "to the feast for those who walk between." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "Walk between?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He inclined his head toward the frozen figures around the table. "Tonight the veil is thin. Tonight the living may meet the other. Some come by choice, some by mistake, but all are invited. And now, you are here." A cold, deep shiver ran down her spine. She could feel the eyes of all the pale guests upon her, heavy and patient, their silence more terrifying than any scream. Each new candle flickered in unison, shadows stretching long and skeletal across the walls. Her lips parted, but no words would come out. She wanted to move, to step back, but her feet felt rooted to the floor as though the very wood itself held her in place. The man tilted his head again, his voice soft as a sigh. "Do not fear. You are not alone. You have been chosen." And as his words settled in the room, the doors creaked shut. Though Martha had not touched them, the sound echoed like a final, metallic bell through the hall, sealing her within the feast of shadows. Martha's mind raced, yet her body remained frozen, held by a sudden, consuming awe. The silver-eyed figures at the table did not move, but their collective presence pressed upon her like a cold, immense wind. She could smell the faint metallic tang of the room, now mixed with the rich, overpowering aroma of the untouched feast. Each scent seemed to whisper secrets she could not quite grasp. The man at the head of the table stepped closer, his boots making no sound against the wooden floor, only the faint, dry rustle of his tattered coat. "Tonight," he murmured, his voice a dry, rasping sound, "you may join or observe. But choose carefully. Once you sit, there is no turning back until dawn." Martha swallowed hard, tasting the sharp, bitter tang of fear in her mouth. She glanced at the table again. The plates gleamed as though freshly polished. The food glimmered with a strange, internal warmth. She imagined taking a bite, how the sweetness of caramel apples or the softness of fresh bread might feel on her tongue. But the eyes, the endless, silver eyes of the guests. So many pairs, expectant, waiting. She wanted to step back. Yet the hall seemed to stretch impossibly around her, and the doors were firmly shut, as if the forest itself had followed her inside and sealed the entrance. Even the faint moonlight from the windows appeared muted, smothered beneath a thickening, silver mist. The man's voice floated like smoke through the hall. "Many have walked this path before you. Some never leave. Others return with tales few believe. Will you take a seat, Martha Ellery? Will you partake in the night's ritual?" Martha's hand instinctively went to her shawl, clinging to the rough wool as if it could shield her. Her mind swirled with images of the village outside, of warmth and hearths, of her father returning safely from the farm. Yet something deeper, a trembling curiosity, a strange, compelling pull she could not name, kept her rooted. The candle flames danced in the air, bending slightly toward her as if urging her forward. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, quiet voice whispered, "Observe first. Fear not. The night is longer than you imagine." Martha inhaled deeply, trying to steady the tremor in her limbs. The silver-eyed man extended a hand, palm up, beckoning toward the nearest chair at the table. Martha's feet shuffled forward slowly, each step tentative on the worn wooden floor. The lantern's light flickered, casting shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally along the walls. The closer she drew to the table, the warmer the room felt, but the warmth carried a strange, almost suffocating heaviness, like air trapped in a cellar long forgotten. Her eyes fell on the nearest chair, carved from dark oak, with intricate, strange patterns etched into its back. It looked ordinary at first glance, but upon closer inspection, she noticed faint symbols carved into the wood, circles intertwined with lines, almost like a map of the night sky, or perhaps some forgotten language. Her hand hovered over the chair, the lantern quivering in her grip. A quiet whisper echoed, not from the man, but from the very wood itself, soft as moss, brushing against her fingers, "Sit and see." Martha swallowed hard, her throat dry. The smell of the feast rose again, the roasted meat, sweet apples, soft bread, richer now, more intoxicating. Her stomach twisted with a dizzying mix of hunger and fear. With a trembling hand, she grasped the back of the chair and lowered herself slowly. The wood was cool beneath her fingers, grounding her. As she settled, a strange sensation ran up her spine, a warmth like sunlight, yet tinged with the coldness of the night air. Across the table, the silvery figures remained still, but the air around them seemed to hum faintly, a low, continuous frequency. The man at the head of the table leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable, but patient. "Good," he said softly. "You have taken the first step. Many never do." Martha's eyes roamed over the frozen faces surrounding her. Each one was still, yet she could feel them watching, not with hostility, but with intense expectation, as if they waited to see what she would do next. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, the soft clinking of cutlery, though no hand moved. Plates shifted subtly on the table, the food itself appearing to breathe with a life of its own. A warm, golden light shimmered along the edges of the dishes, inviting and uncanny. Her heartbeat slowed as her initial panic gave way to a detached, fearful awe. Somehow, she understood that this night was a bridge, a space between the living and the unseen, where one could learn secrets meant only for those brave enough to sit. And as the candle flame swayed above, the hall itself seemed to exhale a quiet sigh that mingled with the gentle rustle of the invisible guests. Martha's eyes drifted over the table once more. Though the figures remained still, a faint hum filled the hall like the soft vibration of wind over glass. She realized that the sound was coming not from the guests themselves, but from the feast. The roasted meat seemed to exude a gentle warmth, and the steam rising from the bowls swirled in spirals, catching the candlelight as if performing a delicate, unearthly dance. She reached out hesitantly and lifted a small slice of bread from a plate nearest her. It was soft, almost unnaturally so, and smelled intensely of honey and cinnamon. When she touched it to her lips, the flavor was immediate, warm, sweet, comforting. Yet beneath it, she tasted something else. A hint of smoke, like a fire long extinguished, and a sharp tang of iron, faint but unmistakable. As she chewed slowly, the whispers began. Not words at first, just a low murmur like the rush of leaves over dry earth. Then, as her senses sharpened from the food, she began to discern fragments. Remember the first step. Do not fear the eyes. Her gaze darted to the silver-eyed figures. They were still, unblinking, silent. But now she felt certain they were listening, that the murmurs were part of the ritual. The feast itself seemed alive. Each dish offering not just sustenance, but a story, a fragment of history, a memory, a warning. Martha's fingers shook as she reached for a slice of apple, its skin glossy and perfect under the candlelight. When she bit into it, juice ran down her chin, sweet and sharp. She swallowed slowly, letting the taste linger. It was as though the apple carried the warmth of autumn itself, and yet beneath it a subtle chill crept along her tongue, reminding her of the night's otherworldly nature. A faint movement caught her eye. The man at the head of the table gestured slightly, though his body remained still, his hand tilted toward the nearest figure. The silver-eyed guests began to shift imperceptibly, leaning toward each other as though acknowledging her presence, yet not breaking their statuesque posture. The hall was alive with whispers, warmth, and shadows. The rhythm of the feast seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the night itself, slow, patient, and mesmerizing. And in the corner, a shadow detached itself from the wall. A small, pale child, stepping carefully toward her. Martha's eyes widened as the small figure moved closer. The child was no more than 7 or 8, dressed in a tattered colonial dress, her hair pale and tangled. Her silver eyes mirrored those of the other guests, wide and unblinking, yet somehow softer, less imposing. The faintest smile curved her lips, gentle and tentative, like a candle flicker in the dark. The child paused at the edge of Martha's chair. For a moment, silence fell over the hall. Even the whispers of the feast seemed to quiet as though the world itself held its breath. You're not afraid?" the child asked, her voice soft, almost melodic, yet carrying an echo that made it feel like it came. Martha swallowed, her throat tight. I don't know," she admitted, her voice a rough whisper. Her fingers tightened around the lantern handle. "I've never seen anything like this before." The child tilted her head slightly, observing with the gravity of an adult. "Most are. That's why they leave. But you came here. That counts for something." She held out a small, delicate hand, the skin almost translucent in the candlelight. "Sit with me. Learn the feast." Martha hesitated, glancing at the frozen figures around the table. The silver-eyed guests remained statuesque, yet somehow their presence felt less threatening than the child's quiet insistence. The warmth of the feast and the gentle hum of whispers invited her. Slowly, she shifted her chair slightly, moving it to the edge of the table where the child had indicated. The little hand hovered near the bread, guiding her without touch. Martha felt a subtle but profound change in the atmosphere, a shift from mere terrifying observation to active participation.